Today I want to talk to you about both artists Tania Bruguera and Felix Gonzales Torres, both of which are Cuban and installation artists. Both of them were definitely born in Cuba and eventually moved into the United States. They both tackled social/political themes. They both expressed their art in a symbolic manner, which helped them feel safe as they can defend it as their art. For example, you'll come to find that Bruguera finds a way to defend her art from censorship. So a little bit about her. She was born in Cuba. The difference from her and Felix is that she is a performance artist, so she herself is performing in the art. Much of her work, like I mentioned, is social political. She considers herself an artivist with art and activism. Much of her themes rely on power, censorship, migration. She's actually the daughter of a Cuban politician known as Miguel Bruguera, and her most well-known performance would be Tatlin's Whisper, and this is the Havana version. In this version, she is in Havana, she's in Cuba, and she is telling us that this is a art performance when really this is a moment where she asks people, citizens of Havana, to come up to the podium and speak their mind for 1 minute. This is something that was not really deemed possible. It was not deemed legal because of censorship. Framing this as a performance was a great way for her to make this a possibility for people, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because she was giving them a moment to speak. Had they not said anything, also said something about it, so anybody witnessing this event could get a sense of what it was like to be a citizen of Cuba who had no ability to talk about what they felt about their country. In the Hyundai Commission, it was based in London, England, and it was a way to introduce conversation about migration and to explore the empathy and whether or not we can still feel it for people, especially who are refugees. Underneath the ink that was placed on the floor is a large portrait of a Syrian refugee who wanted to become a doctor. Currently, he is working with other youth to help them and their opportunities. Tania was really responding to how we make large images of royalty, how there's plenty of images of royalty made on large paintings and such. They are often glorified, whereas she wants to make this person who is not well known and give him a moment of recognition. The image underneath is meant to become visible with heat from other people's bodies. So as you can see, there are imprints of that laying on the floor. Tatlin's Whisper, as I mentioned previously, this is also at Tate Modern in London, and here she is offering the audience a upfront experience with power. She really hopes that people are not taking this as art, because you can make associations with this art. She wants it to come off as a live event, a representation of how people react in front of power. And if you watch the video, it seems like they forget the imagery of police on a horse is a image of power that we see often in media, and it is considered a very powerful image. This is a piece that really requires the audience participation, because otherwise it would just be men on horses. They are reacting and making this piece complete. The audience is in a more submissive role here. This one is stronger in terms of content. I think that as a performance artist, she's very provocative. She definitely puts her audience in a very uncomfortable situation. Here she is reading, in Paris, she is reading reflections of political art, institutions, and society. Next to her is a box containing a pistol. Think of this as a Russian roulette, That happens as she's reading through these reflections, and at the end of the passage, she puts the gun up to her head and she essentially pulls the trigger and nothing comes out. It's blank, right? After that, she then fires again at the sky and there's an actual bullet. Then it becomes a panel where the audience then asks her questions. The purpose of the performance is she really wants to express how artists will sacrifice and how what she herself is willing to go through as she speaks. She exercises her freedom of speech, right? It's not something that her in Cuba was used to, so it meant that she was putting herself on the line here. This is all about questioning the artist's role in their art, what they are willing to self-sacrifice, what are they willing to commit to. This performance itself talks about what it means to really put yourself on the line and what it means to speak your mind and how dangerous it can be. Another impactful performance that she herself did was still in Havana. I want to say that this was early on in her career. As you can see, she is carrying a decapitated lamb, and she's walking through the streets of Havana, and people are watching her eat dirt, and we wonder, well, what does that mean? In this particular piece, she's really reacting to the fall of the Soviet Union, which was in the early 90s. That meant that Cuba would then be able to restructure their government, but then nothing happens. They still go about their usual agenda and nothing is being done to be fixed. Well, now the term to eat dirt in Spanish for Cubans means that you are being put through suffering just to suffer rather than having some sort of change to ease that suffering, right? It is also a reference to how indigenous Cubans used to eat dirt as suicide to resist Spanish conquistadors. It also alludes to the suffering of Jews and their Passover ritual and from being enslaved in Egypt. Okay, moving on to Felix Gonzales Torres. He is an installation artist. He does a lot of work that is also social, political, but his stuff focuses more on LGBT, and he does touch on some capitalistic themes. What we find in a lot of his artwork is that he is constantly tackling these themes of life, loss, death, some sort of decay, some sort of depletion, right? We see that a lot in his work. So what does that mean? I had the privilege to experience this one firsthand at the Art Institute, and so the audience was encouraged to take from this pile of candy. Now, this pile of candy is called a portrait because it's representational of his former partner. His name was Ross. He was suffering from AIDS. This pile of candy weighs exactly what his ideal weight would have been at the peak of his health before AIDS began to affect him. So when we are taking from this pile of candy, we are also participating in that depletion. In the next one, this is a similar concept, and I did want to point out that it's very interesting how the same medium and the same approach is being done to this artwork, but the simple act of changing the colors gives us a new image and a new association. Now, this has everything to do with America and capitalism, consumerism, and now he is addressing that. When the audience comes in, they take from the candy, and it represents that. These are two clocks that are in sync. They start at the same time. They can be reset at the same time if one of them breaks or if they are out of sync. And again, this is connected to Ross, and he is forcing himself to face this inevitable topic of time. He's terrified of time and he just wants to face it. Eventually, these clocks will unsync. This is just another simple example of the things you can find in his gallery. These were definitely part of his photos that come from his life. These are personally tied to him. What I wanted to point out is that there is a fragility that occurs here. When you see these in person, it feels as though they could come apart at any moment, and that really does speak to the deterioration. This is part of his Dateline series, and the way that they are displayed, they are around the very top of a wall. What you will see here are names, dates, small descriptions, a lot of things including the date. And perhaps this is not relevant to everyone, it's relevant to himself, which he calls self-portrait. This is kind of a collaboration with the viewer where they can reflect on this artwork and think of their choice of words that they might put up for themselves. Felix did ask the gallery that they should change words as they pleased. This is another example of his datelines. He's bringing attention to his political background, the LGBT Stonewall situation. There were LGBT protests against police who were trying to oppress LGBT people during these times.
With Gonzales Torres, that this was an extremely emotional practice. He was not an artist like you can imagine many of the artists working in minimalism, where there was a kind of cold authority and distance in their work through the materials, through the strict geometries. One of the things you quickly understand in the exhibition, I hope, is that these pieces start out with their reference to minimalism and the look of a certain geometry, but they're meant, as soon as a visitor comes and touches it and takes it, to become wobbly, formless, different, changing.
So this is a small recap as to what differences and similarities there are. This is a personal work of mine, one that I've worked on in my senior seminar. This was a spread from my poetry book where I am combining type and I am combining imagery, and my text is broken in a cadence similar to Stéphane Mallarmé and his book of poetry. I really resonated with both of these artists. I do believe that there is a necessity to be provocative with politics, and I also believe that there is a necessity to be subtle with your viewer and have them reflect. I think both approaches can be very effective, since not one person is going to react to both of them the same. So I really responded to Felix because of his way of being private, but also a little bit cryptic with his words, a little bit personal, doesn't give you everything, but allows you to kind of immerse yourself. So that pretty much wraps it all up. I hope you enjoyed, so thank you very much.